Good morning. Well, we're continuing with our sermon series, the super fruits, the fruit of the Spirit. And today's fruit is usually translated faithfulness. But if you go back to the Greek of it, and the fruit of the Spirit, if I haven't mentioned it before, are the most complete list comes out of Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. And in that list, the word in the Greek is pistis, which really just means faith. We tend to use the word faithfulness, and I think some of that is because really faithfulness is kind of the acting out, the actually doing of faith. Certainly, faith is something that we should have, but if we don't act upon that faith, then what good is it really doing us? Where's my Bible? So this morning I want to read a few selected verses from Hebrews chapter 11. And if you're familiar with Hebrews, and especially this chapter, the whole chapter's focus is faith. And those that we can look to as examples of the faith. And in fact, it starts, chapter 11, verse 1, with a definition of biblical faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It's the conviction of things not seen. So faith is believing in something, is trusting in something that we can't necessarily see, that's not necessarily tangible, that we can't kind of wrap our hands around. In fact, if we had that which we have faith in, or that which we hope for, then we wouldn't need hope or faith because we'd already have it. I mean, I might hope that I'm getting a new cell phone, but once I get that new cell phone, I don't have to hope anymore. It's already there. And that's the thing with faith is hoping in something that we can't necessarily just put our hands around it. It's having the conviction of something that we can't necessarily prove or look at or see. And it's trusting in a God that we can't necessarily see, and yet many of us have stories of how we have experienced God acting in our lives, and our faith is built upon that. And that's the thing with faith, is I think we tend to have this black or white thinking, that either you have faith or you don't have faith. That if we make a mistake, well, you know, we're off God's list. But faith is something that develops. I mean, if you think of human relationships and trust in human relationships, it doesn't just happen. It builds over time. You learn to trust someone else through experience. And it's the same with God. And that's why I think some of the rest of this chapter are very helpful for us as we look to develop faith in our lives. And one of my favorites is Abraham. And in verse 8 in chapter 11, it tells us, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. Now, that's pretty incredible right from the beginning. If you know the story of Abraham, when we are introduced to Abraham, he is 75 years old. We really don't know much of anything about him prior to that, except that he lived in Ur, which is in what is now Iraq. In fact, it's right near, way back in the first Desert Storm. It's pretty much right close to where they came in from the bay down there. And that's where he starts out. And it doesn't tell us that he had any prior relationship with Yahweh, this God, who appears to him and says, I want you to pack up everything. I want you to leave your home and your family and just follow me to a place that I'll show you when we get there. Now, I don't know about you, but I like a little more detail. I want to know, okay, where are we going? How long is it going to take to get there? When about are we going to get there? And what's the deal going to be? You know, what are the arrangements going to be once we arrive? Well, he's not given any of that. So I have to admit, Abraham starts out with a fairly amazing level of faith. Now, because we're not told anything about him, we could imagine that maybe, you know, he really was glad to get out of Ur. Maybe things hadn't really gone all that well, and his family was driving him crazy, and he was looking for some opportunity to go somewhere else. But we're not told that. But God comes to him, and he follows. And he follows God, and they end up in this area called Canaan. And God shows him the land and says, one day, this land will belong to your descendants. Now, remember, when we first met Abraham, he was 75. His wife's only a couple of years younger. They're a little past childbearing, and they have no children at this point. And so, in verse 11 of chapter 11 in Hebrews, by faith, Abraham received power of procreation, even though he was too old, and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven, and as innumerable as grains of sand by the seashore. So here this 75-year-old man and his barren wife are told, you are going to be the father of multitudes. Yeah, right. How is that going to happen? But for whatever reason, Abraham believed God. Now, I say that, but this is what I think is perhaps the part of the story that gives us the most hope. Because at 75, he's made the promise. Isaac is not born until he was 99, almost 100. Almost 25 years, and he's as good as dead at 75. He's past childbearing at 75, and he's made this promise, and 25 years, nothing. And if you read the story, his faith isn't so great all the way along. I mean, they make a couple of trips to Egypt when he tells his wife to tell the leadership that she's his sister, because he's afraid that they'll take a liking to her and want to kill him to get her. Now, think about that, ladies. She is barren. She is well along in years, and he is still worried that some man is going to try and steal her away from him. And in fact, they do. Sarah must have been quite a looker. But it shows that his faith in God's protection is not maybe where it should be. And then they go through a number of different things, he and his wife, as the years pass, and this promise that God has made to them doesn't come to fruition, and they begin questioning, and Sarah begins to think, well, obviously God has something else in mind, and he's not intending to use me, because there's no way that I'm having a baby now. And so she offers him Hagar, her maidservant. And quite frankly, we are still suffering the consequences today of that decision, because from that union came Ishmael, the father of all of the Arabs and the Muslim faith. And their descendants are still battling to this very day. But it showed that as great as sometimes Abraham's faith seems to us, and we have a tendency to want to say, don't think I could ever have the kind of faith that someone like Abraham had. Well, it took some time for that faith to develop. There were many times when he doubted, when he wasn't sure. He knew God had made the promise, and it took him some time to learn to trust God. It took him some time to develop that relationship, for him to be sure that God was trustworthy. And it happened. As we move on in verse 17, by faith Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you." He considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Now, I want you to imagine this thought process, this dilemma. At 75 years old, you are told that you are going to be the father of multitudes, of many nations. 25 years you wait, believing that this God who promised it would somehow come through. But 25 years go by very slowly, and there's nothing to show for it. There's no obvious hope that this is going to happen. And then finally, your wife becomes pregnant. That's a whole nother area of faith. Imagining Sarah at her advanced age actually carrying a child through 9 months of pregnancy. Just think about that for a minute. But it finally happens, and the child is born healthy. You finally have the answer. You finally have that which was promised. Now, it's not quite multitudes, but at least it's a start. And then one morning you wake up, and this same God, the same God who had made the promise, the same God who had fulfilled the promise says, okay, now here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this child Isaac, the only child that you have. You're now over 100 years old. But I want you to take this child, I want you to take him up to the top of Mount Moriah, and I want you to build an altar there, and I want you to sacrifice your son. Are you kidding me? How does that even make sense? This is the promised child. This is the one that you said, and it's only one. There's still the multitudes to come. How can I sacrifice this, the only child? But by this time, Abraham had learned. Through his ongoing relationship with God, Abraham had learned to trust God. No, it didn't make sense. It made no sense at all. From a human perspective, it's a ridiculous request. Even thousands of years later, we read it and we think, what was God thinking? But Abraham had learned to trust God. Abraham had learned that God is faithful, and that even though it didn't make sense, if God was asking him to do it, he must have a plan, even if it meant sacrificing his son and God raising him from the dead. And so Abraham sets out. And I have to say, if you go back and you read the story, the part that gets me every time is when he and Isaac are walking up the slopes of Mount Moriah. And this little boy looks up at his father and says, Daddy, we've got the wood here for the sacrifice, but where is the lamb? And I think, how, as a father, how could you even begin to answer that question? I can't imagine what went on between the two of them. But Abraham trusts God. And sure enough, it tells us in the story that as they are making their way up the one side of Mount Moriah, a ram is making his way up the other side. And just as he's about to plunge the knife into his only son, God stops him and says, "Now, Abraham, now I know that you trust me, because you have not withheld your one and only son." Now, I don't know whether Abraham knew at that time that God himself would sacrifice his one and only son for you and for me. But he was willing. He was willing to do what God had called him to do because he had learned to trust him. But that trust took time. It took time to develop that relationship. And so part of what I want to share with you this morning is not to lose heart. We don't all right now, in fact, I would be surprised if any of us right now this morning would say that we had faith like Abraham's at the end of the story. But prior to the end of the story, Abraham didn't have faith like Abraham. It takes time to develop that relationship and that trust. But here is the important thing to remember. We can't develop that trust if we never test it. We can't know that God is faithful unless we try and trust him. We can't learn to develop trust in God if we don't step out in faith and see that God is faithful. And so we have to actually act upon our faith. We have to follow God. Little steps at first. You don't have to start with sacrificing a child, although for some of us. Just kidding, Devin. But you can't develop that trust unless you act upon it, unless you try it, unless you let God lead. And you begin to learn that he is faithful and that you can trust him, that he will lead you. In fact, this morning as we gather around this table, it reminds us of God's incredible trustworthiness, his incredible faithfulness, that he, in fact, did what he asked Abraham to do. He sent his one and only son, and he sacrificed him that we might be forgiven, that we might have new life. So as we gather around this table, let us remember God's faithfulness. And let us commit ourselves to stepping out in faith, to trusting God, to lead us and to guide us, and to be faithful to us in all that he calls us to do. In Jesus' name, amen.